The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Fairmont ballroom. Every head turned toward me. 200 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, their faces twisted with disgust and embarrassment. But it wasn't the broken glass that made my blood run cold. It was the single word that escaped the waiter's lips as he knelt to clean up my mess. Commander! I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Blackwood request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Victoria Blackwood, to Mr. Jonathan Pierce Whitmore III. At the bottom, in smaller print that felt like an afterthought, +1 welcome. I stared at that invitation for 20 minutes, sitting in my cramped studio apartment in Queens, surrounded by overdue bills and takeout containers. Victoria Blackwood, my college roommate's little sister. The girl who used to sneak into our dorm room to steal my textbooks because she was too embarrassed to ask for help with her own studies. Now she was marrying into one of the oldest families in Connecticut, and somehow I'd made the guest list. The truth was I almost didn't go. What did I have in common with these people anymore? I worked double shifts at a warehouse in Long Island City, came home exhausted every night, and spent my weekends doing laundry and watching Netflix. The last time I'd worn a suit was to my father's funeral 2 years ago, and even then, it was a cheap rental that didn't quite fit right. But something about that invitation nagged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was masochism. Or maybe, buried deep down, there was still a part of me that remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere. So I spent my last $400 on a decent suit from Men's Warehouse, practiced walking without limping too obviously, and took the train to Greenwich on a Saturday morning in early October. The Fairmont Country Club was exactly what I'd expected. Sprawling lawns that probably required a full-time staff to maintain, ivy-covered walls that screamed old money, and valet parking that made my decision to take an Uber seem even more pathetic. I stood at the entrance for a full 5 minutes, watching guests stream past me in their designer everything, before finally working up the courage to walk inside. The ceremony was held in a garden pavilion overlooking Long Island Sound. I found a seat in the back row, behind a massive pillar that partially obscured my view but kept me hidden from most of the other guests. Victoria looked radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my annual salary, and Jonathan looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone named Jonathan Pierce Whitmore III, tall, blonde, and born with a silver spoon surgically attached to his mouth. During the reception, I made the mistake of trying to blend in. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing server and attempted to make small talk with the people at my assigned table. Table 18, tucked away in a corner near the kitchen doors. The singles table. The charity cases table. The quote A-plane we had to invite them, but let's make sure they know their place table. So, how do you know Victoria? Asked a woman named Brenda, whose voice carried the practiced disinterest of someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth her time. College, I said, taking a sip of champagne that probably cost more than my hourly wage. Her brother Marcus and I were roommates at Columbia. Brenda's eyebrows shot up with surprise that quickly morphed into something approaching disgust. Oh, you're one of Marcus's friends. The way she said friends made it clear that she'd heard stories. Probably about the scholarship kid who didn't belong, who crashed their exclusive parties, and dated girls who were supposed to be off-limits to people like me. The one who disappeared without explanation during senior year and never looked back. Something like that, I muttered. The conversation died after that. Brenda turned to chat with the hedge fund manager on her other side, and I was left to pick at my rubber chicken in silence. I watched the beautiful people dance to a 12-piece orchestra, made small talk about their summer houses in the Hamptons, and their children at boarding schools whose names I'd only heard in movies. I was invisible, worse than invisible. I was an inconvenience. A reminder that not everyone at this perfect celebration belonged to their perfect world. When I got up to use the bathroom, conversations stopped mid-sentence. When I approached the bar, other guests somehow materialized ahead of me in line. When I tried to congratulate Victoria during the receiving line, her smile was polite but distant, like she was greeting a stranger rather than someone who'd helped her pass calculus freshman year. By the time dinner was served, I'd already decided to leave. I'd make my excuses, slip out during the salad course, and take the train back to Queens where I belonged. But as I stood up to go, my knee, still held together with pins and screws from an injury that ended everything, gave out completely. The champagne glass went flying. Crystal exploded across marble. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me with a mixture of horror and barely concealed glee. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered something about the help not knowing how to behave at a proper event. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and pretend this whole humiliating evening had never happened. But then the waiter appeared, a young guy, maybe early 20s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. He knelt down to collect the broken glass, and that's when he looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. "Welcome back, Commander." The world stopped. Not in the romantic movie scene way, but in the cold, terrifying way that happens when your carefully constructed new life collides head-on with the past you've spent 3 years trying to forget. The waiter, I could see now he was maybe 22, with the lean build of someone who'd seen real physical training, stood up slowly, still holding pieces of broken crystal. His name tag read Danny Martinez, but his posture screamed military. The way he held his shoulders, the precision of his movements, even the way he'd addressed me. This kid knew exactly who I was. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I whispered, glancing around nervously. The other guests had already lost interest in my embarrassing display and returned to their conversations about yacht clubs and private schools. Danny's eyes never left mine. "Negative, sir. 2nd Lieutenant Martinez, 82nd Airborne. You probably don't remember me, but I was at FOB Henderson when you pulled our convoy out of that ambush in Kandahar province. March 15th, 2019. The date hit me like a physical blow, March 15th. The day everything changed. The day I learned that split-second decisions in a war zone could save 8 lives and destroy your own in the process." "Martinez," I said quietly, the memory flooding back despite my best efforts to keep it buried. "You were the communications specialist. Took shrapnel in your left shoulder." His face lit up with something between relief and vindication. "You do remember, sir, what you did that day." "Was my job?" I cut him off, more harshly than I intended, nothing more. But Danny wasn't deterred. He finished collecting the glass, dumped it in a nearby bus tub, and then did something that made my blood run cold. He straightened to attention and gave me a subtle but unmistakable salute. Not the kind of casual wave civilians might mistake for scratching his forehead, but a real military salute. Quick, precise, respectful. "Danny," I hissed, grabbing his arm, "what are you doing?" "Showing respect where it's due," he said simply. "You saved my life, Commander. You saved all our lives." I pulled him aside, away from the tables and into an alcove near the coat check. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure everyone in the ballroom could hear it. "Listen to me very carefully. That was a long time ago. That person doesn't exist anymore. My name is Michael Chen, I work in a warehouse, and I have absolutely nothing to do with the military. Do you understand?" Danny studied my face with the kind of intensity they teach you in combat situations. Reading micro-expressions, looking for tells, trying to separate truth from deception. "With all due respect, sir, you can change your name and your job, but you can't change what you did, what you are." "What I am," I said through gritted teeth, "is nobody. Just another face in the crowd trying to get through a wedding without making a complete ass of himself, which, clearly, I've already failed at." But even as I said the words, I could feel something stirring inside me, something I'd been working very hard to keep buried. The way Danny looked at me, not with pity or disgust like the other guests, but with genuine respect and admiration, reminded me of a time when I mattered. When my decisions meant something. When people looked to me for answers, instead of looking through me like I was invisible. "How did you end up here?" I asked, desperate to change the subject. Danny glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "GI Bill got me through culinary school." Turns out I'm pretty good with a knife, even when I'm not in a combat zone. Been working events like this for about 6 months now. Good money, and it's honest work. That's good, I said, and meant it. You should be proud. What about you, sir? What brings you to a place like this? I almost laughed at the question. What brought me here? Poor judgment, nostalgia. A desperate desire to prove to myself that I could still function in polite society, even though every interaction tonight had proven the opposite. I knew the bride in college, I said, before. Danny nodded like he understood exactly what before meant. In military circles, there's always a before and after. Before deployment, after deployment. Before the injury, after the injury. Before the incident that changes everything, after you learn to live with the consequences. Can I ask what happened? He said quietly. After you left, I mean. Command never told us anything except that you'd been reassigned. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Reassigned. Such a clean, bureaucratic word for what had actually happened. Like I'd simply been moved from one office to another, rather than medically discharged and abandoned to figure out how to be a civilian again after 12 years in uniform. It's complicated, I said. Most things worth talking about are. I looked at this kid, this young man who'd probably seen more combat at 22 than most people see in a lifetime, and felt something crack open inside my chest. When was the last time someone had asked me a real question? When was the last time someone had looked at me and seen more than just a guy who couldn't afford to be here? I got hurt, I said finally, bad enough that they decided I was more of a liability than an asset. Medical discharge, full pension but no prospects. Turns out, former Army Ranger doesn't look great on a resume when you're applying for civilian jobs, especially when you can't pass a physical. Danny's expression darkened. That's bullshit, sir. Begging your pardon, but that's complete bullshit. You're one of the best officers I ever served under. The way you handled that ambush. The way I handled that ambush is exactly why I'm standing here in a rented suit, invisible to everyone in this room, I said. Because the decision I made that day, the one that saved your life and 7 others, also meant I took a rocket-propelled grenade to the knee and spent the next 14 months learning how to walk again. The words came out harder and more bitter than I'd intended. I'd never said any of this out loud before. Not to the VA counselors, not to my family, not even to myself in the mirror during those dark months when walking to the mailbox felt like climbing Everest. Danny was quiet for a long moment. Around us, the wedding reception continued in full swing. The orchestra was playing something classical and expensive sounding. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, and told each other stories about their fabulous lives. None of them had any idea that 2 veterans were having a very different kind of conversation just a few feet away. You know what I think? Danny said finally. What's that? I think you're looking at this all wrong. You're standing here talking about being invisible, being nobody, like that's some kind of punishment you deserve. But from where I'm standing, you're the only person in this entire ballroom who actually matters. I stared at him. What are you talking about? Look around, sir. Really look. What do you see? I followed his gaze across the crowd of wedding guests. Rich people, having a good time. I see people who've never made a decision that meant anything to anyone. People who've never had someone else's life in their hands. People who think courage means choosing between the salmon and the chicken for dinner. Danny's voice was quiet but intense. You know what real courage is? It's getting up every morning and choosing to keep going when everything inside you wants to quit. It's coming to a place like this where you know you don't fit in, just because someone invited you and you thought you should try. I felt something shift in my chest. Not healing exactly, but like a bone that had been set wrong was finally being reset properly. Danny. No, sir, let me finish. These people in their fancy clothes and expensive cars, they're playing dress up. But you? You're the real thing, and maybe it's time you started acting like it. Danny's words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Act like the real thing. Easy for him to say. He still had his whole life ahead of him. Still believed that doing the right thing would somehow be rewarded in the end. I'd learned the hard way that the universe doesn't keep score the way we think it does. But before I could respond, a commotion erupted from the main dining area. Raised voices, the sound of chairs scraping against marble, and then a woman's scream that cut through the orchestral music like a knife. Danny and I exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that happens between people who've been trained to respond to crisis. Without thinking, we both moved toward the sound. What we found was chaos. Near the head table, an elderly man in a wheelchair, someone I vaguely recognized as Jonathan's grandfather, was slumped forward, his face gray, and his breathing labored. His wife was screaming for help while wedding guests stood around in various states of panic and uselessness. "Someone call 911!" shouted the father of the bride, but his voice carried more panic than authority. "Already did," called someone from across the room holding up their phone. "They're saying 15 minutes minimum." 15 minutes! I'd seen enough medical emergencies to know that 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours when someone was having what looked like a major cardiac event. The crowd parted as Victoria pushed through in her wedding dress, tears streaming down her face. "Grandpa William, please, stay with us." A man I assumed was the family doctor elbowed his way forward, but I could tell from his hesitation that he was out of his depth. Probably a dermatologist or plastic surgeon, someone who hadn't dealt with real medical emergencies since residency 20 years ago. "He needs CPR, the doctor said uncertainty, but I'm not sure. The liability." That's when training kicked in. Not the warehouse training or the civilian job training, but the deep, muscle memory training that had been drilled into me over 12 years of military service. The training that had kept 8 soldiers alive in an Afghan desert and cost me everything I thought my life was supposed to be. I was moving before I realized I'd made the decision. "Excuse me," I said, pushing through the crowd with authority I hadn't used in 3 years. People stepped aside automatically, something in my voice, my posture, my presence commanding obedience, even though I was wearing a rental suit and limping slightly. The doctor looked up as I knelt beside the wheelchair. "Are you medical personnel?" "Combat medic training," I said, already checking William's pulse and breathing, weak and irregular but present. "What's his medical history?" "Heart condition," Victoria said through her tears. "He had bypass surgery last year, and he's on blood thinners." I nodded, processing the information while my hands moved automatically through triage procedures I hadn't used since Afghanistan. William was conscious but disoriented, his skin clammy and pale. Classic signs of cardiac distress, but not full arrest. Not yet. "We need to get him flat," I said to no one in particular. "Clear this table." For a moment, nobody moved. These people weren't used to taking orders from strangers, especially not from someone who looked like the help. But then Danny appeared at my shoulder. "You heard the commander," he said, his voice carrying the sharp authority of a soldier following orders. "Clear the table, now." Something in Danny's tone, or maybe the word commander, galvanized the crowd. Suddenly everyone was moving, clearing dishes and centerpieces from the nearest table. Jonathan and 2 of his groomsmen carefully lifted William from his wheelchair and laid him flat on his back. I knelt beside him, checking his vitals again. His pulse was getting weaker, more erratic. We were running out of time. "William," I said, leaning close to his ear, "can you hear me? I need you to stay with us." His eyes focused on mine with effort. "Can't? Breathe." "I know, we're gonna help you, but I need you to stay calm and keep breathing for me." I looked up at the crowd of faces staring down at us. 200 wedding guests who moments ago had treated me like an unwelcome intruder, now hanging on my every word. It was surreal and terrifying and oddly familiar. "I need someone to find an AED if this place has one," I called out. "Check with the staff, the pro shop, anywhere they might keep emergency equipment." 3 people immediately scattered to search. In a crisis, people want to help. They just need someone to tell them how. "Danny," I said, "I need you to help me monitor his breathing. If he stops, we start compressions immediately." "Roger that, sir." I turned to Victoria, who was hovering nearby in her elaborate wedding dress, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Victoria, I need you to talk to him. Keep him conscious. Tell him about the wedding, about how beautiful everything is. Keep his mind focused on something positive." She nodded and took her grandfather's hand. "Grandpa, it's me, Victoria. You're at my wedding, remember? You said I look like Grandma Elizabeth when she was young. You promised you'd dance with me later. William's eyes tracked to his granddaughter's face, and some of the panic in his expression eased. Good, stress was the enemy right now. I checked my watch. It had been 3 minutes since the emergency started. 12 minutes until paramedics arrived, assuming they were on time. In combat, 12 minutes was an eternity. Here, surrounded by crystal and fine china instead of sand and gunfire, it felt even longer. "How is he?" asked the family doctor, hovering uselessly nearby. "Stable for now," I said, "but his heart rhythm is getting more irregular. If this progresses to full cardiac arrest before the paramedics arrive, we're going to have to make some difficult decisions." The doctor paled. "I don't think I'm qualified to." "Then step back and let me handle it." The words came out harder than I intended, but there was no time for politeness. This wasn't about egos or credentials or who belonged where. This was about keeping an 80-year-old man alive long enough for real medical help to arrive. I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Jonathan, the groom, standing beside me. His perfect hair was disheveled and his face was pale, but his voice was steady. "Whatever you need," he said simply, "just tell us what to do." Something shifted in that moment, not just in Jonathan, but in the entire crowd. They weren't looking at me like an intruder anymore. They were looking at me like someone who knew what he was doing. Someone they could trust. Someone who belonged exactly where he was. I checked William's pulse again. Still weak but holding steady. His breathing was shallow but regular. We were holding the line but barely. "Someone needs to go outside and flag down the ambulance when it arrives," I said. "Make sure they know we're in the main ballroom and that we have an elderly cardiac patient." 2 groomsmen immediately volunteered and headed for the exit. "Danny, what's our time?" 7 minutes since onset, sir. 8 minutes until ETA. I nodded. 8 minutes. In Afghanistan, I'd once kept a soldier with a sucking chest wound alive for 43 minutes until a medevac helicopter could reach us. 8 minutes should be manageable. Should be. William's eyes fluttered closed, and I felt his pulse skip and weaken. "William!" Victoria called, squeezing his hand. "Stay with us!" His pulse was becoming more erratic, more dangerous. We were approaching the point where talking and monitoring wouldn't be enough, where I'd have to make the kind of split-second decision that had defined my military career and ended it. The kind of decision that separated the people who belonged in crisis situations from the people who just watched from the sidelines. I looked around at the faces surrounding us. Danny's steady determination, Victoria's desperate hope, Jonathan's quiet trust, even the uncertain but willing expressions of wedding guests who'd never experienced anything like this. They were all looking at me, waiting for me to save the day just like my soldiers used to do. Just like I'd been trained to do for 12 years before everything fell apart. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing. Instead, for the first time in 3 years, it felt like coming home. William's pulse flatlined under my fingers. "He's in cardiac arrest," I announced, my voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade. "Danny, start compressions. Victoria, step back but keep talking to him." Danny immediately positioned himself over William's chest, his hands locked and ready. This wasn't his first medical emergency either. I could tell from the way he moved, the complete absence of hesitation. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths, I instructed, tilting William's head back to clear his airway. "Keep the rhythm steady." The crowd watched in stunned silence as we began CPR. Danny's compressions were textbook perfect, deep, fast, allowing complete chest recoil between pushes. I handled the rescue breathing, feeling for the rise and fall of William's chest with each breath I forced into his lungs. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, Danny counted under his breath, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. After the first cycle, I checked for a pulse. Nothing. "Continue," I said. It was during the 3rd cycle that everything changed. Not with William. He was still unconscious, still dependent on our hands keeping his blood flowing, but with the people around us. "Is there anything else we can do?" asked a voice from the crowd. I looked up to see Brenda, the woman who'd barely acknowledged my existence at dinner, standing with her designer purse open, frantically digging through it. I have aspirin, she said. Baby aspirin. I read somewhere that it can help with heart attacks. Good thinking, I said, accepting the small bottle she handed me. We'll give him some as soon as he's conscious. Then Jonathan's father stepped forward. Theodore Blackwood, old Connecticut money personified. A man who probably hadn't taken orders from anyone in decades. The club manager is bringing a defibrillator from the golf course, he said. Should be here in 2 minutes. Others began offering help without being asked. Someone appeared with ice water and clean towels. Another guest, a woman I'd noticed earlier making snide comments about the mixed company at the wedding, was now coordinating with the ambulance dispatch to make sure they had detailed directions to our exact location. But it was Victoria who surprised me most. Still in her wedding dress, still crying, but no longer the helpless bride watching her special day fall apart. She knelt beside her grandfather's head, stroking his hair and speaking to him in a steady, calm voice. "Remember when you taught me to fish at Lake George?" she said. "I was 7, and I was so impatient. You told me that the best things in life required patience and persistence. You said giving up was never an option for Blackwood." Her voice cracked slightly. "So don't you dare give up now, Grandpa. Don't you dare!" During the 5th cycle of compressions, William's eyes fluttered open. "Stop compressions," I said immediately, checking his pulse. Weak, but present. His breathing was shallow, but steady. "William?" I leaned close to his face. "Can you hear me?" His eyes found mine, unfocused but aware. "What happened?" "You had a heart attack," I said simply. "We've got paramedics coming, and you're going to be fine. But I need you to stay still and keep breathing for me." He nodded weakly, then his gaze shifted to take in the crowd of faces surrounding him. His granddaughter in her wedding dress, his family and friends all looking down at him with concern and relief, and 2 men he'd never met before who just saved his life. "Who?" he started to ask, but I shook my head. "Rest. Don't try to talk." The ambulance arrived exactly when promised. 2 paramedics burst through the ballroom doors with a stretcher and equipment, moving with the efficient urgency of people who did this every day. I gave them a rapid-fire rundown of William's condition, the timeline of events, and the interventions we'd performed. "You did good work," the lead paramedic said, attaching William to their cardiac monitor. "Probably saved his life." As they prepared to transport William to the hospital, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Thank you," he whispered. I nodded. "Take care of yourself." But as the paramedics wheeled him toward the exit, William called out loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "Victoria, you make sure that young man stays for the rest of your wedding. Anyone who can save a life belongs at this celebration." The silence that followed was deafening. 200 guests stared at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not the dismissive looks from earlier. Not the polite tolerance of someone who didn't belong. Something else entirely. Then Jonathan did something that shocked everyone, including himself. He walked over, extended his hand, and looked me directly in the eye. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," he said. "I'm Jonathan Whitmore." "Michael Chen." "Michael, I can't thank you enough for what you just did. For my wife's grandfather, for our family." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "And I owe you an apology. We all do." I started to protest, but Jonathan held up his hand. "No, let me say this. Before tonight, I looked at you and saw someone who didn't fit in here. Someone who made me uncomfortable because you reminded me that there's a world outside this bubble we live in. A world where people do real things, important things, while we argue about wine pairings and country club memberships." The crowd was listening to every word, and I could see some uncomfortable shifting among the guests. Jonathan's honesty was cutting a little too close to the bone for some of them. "But watching you tonight," he continued, "seeing how you handled that crisis, the way you took charge and saved a man's life, it made me realize something. You don't not belong here. We don't belong in the same room as you." "Jonathan," I started, but he wasn't finished. "My grandfather always told me that you can judge a man's character by how he acts when nobody's watching and nothing's at stake. But I think he was wrong. You judge a man's character by how he acts when everyone's watching and everything's at stake." He turned to address the room. "This man just saved William Whitmore's life. Not because it was his job, Not because someone asked him to, but because it was the right thing to do. Because when it mattered most, he stepped up and did what needed to be done. The applause started slowly, just one or two people clapping, but it built until the entire ballroom was thundering with appreciation. People were standing, cheering, looking at me with genuine respect and admiration. It should have felt like vindication, like proof that I did belong, that I was worthy of their acceptance. Instead, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like remembering who I used to be. Victoria appeared at my side, still beautiful despite her tear-streaked makeup and slightly disheveled hair. "Michael," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Okay. Are you happy? With your life, I mean. With who you've become since college." The question caught me off guard. Not because it was inappropriate or unexpected, but because it was exactly the question I'd been avoiding asking myself for 3 years. "I'm getting by," I said carefully. "That's not what I asked." I looked around the ballroom, at Danny, who was beaming with pride, at Jonathan, who was looking at me like I was someone worth knowing, at all these people who an hour ago had treated me like furniture and were now treating me like a hero. "No," I said finally, "I'm not happy. I haven't been happy since I left the army." Victoria nodded like she'd expected that answer. "Then maybe it's time to do something about that." Before I could ask what she meant, the orchestra struck up a new song. Something slow and romantic, perfect for the father-daughter dance that had been postponed by the medical emergency. "Victoria," Jonathan said, appearing at her elbow, "they're ready for us." She looked between her new husband and me, then made a decision that surprised everyone. "In a minute," she said. "First, I owe someone a dance." She extended her hand to me. "Michael Chen, would you do me the honor?" The ballroom fell silent again. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was crazy. I was a warehouse worker in a rented suit, dancing with a bride at her own wedding. But looking into Victoria's eyes, I saw something that made all the social conventions irrelevant. I saw someone who understood what it meant to be lost and was offering to help me find my way home. I took her hand. Dancing with Victoria felt like stepping into a different reality, not because of the romance of it, this wasn't some fairy tale moment, but because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about my limitations. I wasn't worried about my knee giving out or whether I belonged here or what people were thinking about me. I was just present, in the moment, moving to music with someone who saw me as more than my failures. "You know," Victoria said as we swayed to the orchestra's gentle melody, "Marcus used to talk about you all the time senior year, before you disappeared." I tensed slightly. Marcus Blackwood, Victoria's brother, my former roommate, one of the few people at Columbia who'd treated me like an equal instead of a charity case. I hadn't spoken to him since I'd left school abruptly to join the army. "He was worried about you," she continued. "Said you were carrying something heavy, something you wouldn't talk about. We all thought it was family stuff or money problems. None of us guessed you were planning to enlist." "It wasn't planned," I said quietly. "It just happened." "Nothing just happens with you, Michael. Marcus always said you were the most deliberate person he knew. Every decision calculated, every move strategic. So why the army?" I looked over her shoulder at the crowd of guests watching us dance. Some with curiosity, some with approval, a few with barely concealed disapproval. But Danny was there too, standing near the bar with something that looked like pride on his face. "Because I needed to matter," I said finally. "At Columbia, I was always going to be the scholarship kid, the one who didn't quite fit. I was good at school, good at pretending I belonged, but I knew it was all temporary. After graduation, I'd go back to being nobody special." Victoria pulled back slightly to look at me. "So you joined the army to become somebody?" "I joined the army because it was the one place where what mattered wasn't where you came from or how much money your family had, it was whether you could do the job. Whether you could be trusted when everything went to hell. And you were good at it." It wasn't a question. Victoria had seen me handle the medical emergency, had watched me take charge of a room full of people who'd been treating me like an intruder. She knew I was good at it. "I was exceptional at it," I said, and for the first time in years there was no false modesty in my voice. I was born for military leadership. Every promotion, every commendation, every mission, It all felt right in a way that nothing else ever had. The song was ending, but neither of us moved to separate. Around us, the wedding reception was slowly returning to normal. Guests were returning to their tables, conversations were resuming, and the orchestra was preparing for the next set. But Victoria and I remained in our small bubble of honesty. "So what happened?" she asked. "Because the Michael I'm dancing with right now isn't someone who gives up easily." Before I could answer, Jonathan appeared at our side. For a moment, I thought he was going to cut in, reclaim his bride from the interloper who'd somehow become the center of attention at his wedding. Instead, he surprised me again. "Mind if I join this conversation?" he asked, "because I think there's something you both need to hear." Victoria and I stepped apart, but remained close enough to continue talking privately. Jonathan looked uncomfortable, like he was about to confess something he'd rather keep hidden. "While you were dancing," he said, "I made a phone call. To my Uncle Richard." I must have looked blank, because Victoria filled in the context. Uncle Richard is a partner at Goldman Sachs. He also sits on the board of several veterans organizations. Jonathan nodded. I told him what happened tonight, how you handled the emergency, the way you took charge, your military background. I thought he might have some insights about veteran transition services, maybe some resources that could help. "That's thoughtful," I said carefully, "but I'm not looking for charity." "Good," Jonathan said, "because he's not offering charity, he's offering a job." The words hit me like a physical blow. What? Richard's firm has been looking for someone to head up their new crisis management division. Someone with real leadership experience. Someone who can handle high-pressure situations and make split-second decisions that affect millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs. Jonathan's voice gained momentum as he spoke. "Someone exactly like you." I stared at him. "You told your uncle to offer me a job based on 15 minutes of CPR?" "No," Victoria interjected. "He told his uncle to offer you a job based on a lifetime of being the person who steps up when others step back. CPR was just the latest example." Danny appeared beside us, having obviously been eavesdropping. "If I may, sir, Mrs. Whitmore is right. What you did tonight wasn't special because it was medical training. It was special because it was leadership. You saw a problem, took responsibility, and got results. That's who you are." I felt overwhelmed, like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. 24 hours ago, I'd been a warehouse worker living in Queens, invisible to everyone around me. Now I was standing in a ballroom full of Connecticut elite, being offered a position at one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street. "I don't understand," I said. "Why would your uncle hire someone he's never met?" Jonathan smiled. "Because Richard Whitmore didn't build a billion-dollar company by playing it safe. He hires people who can deliver results under pressure, people who can be trusted with other people's lives and money, people who don't fold when the stakes get high." "Besides," Victoria added, "it's not like he's hiring you blind. He's flying up from the city tomorrow to meet you in person. Consider tonight a very unusual job interview." I looked around at the three faces staring at me expectantly. Danny with his military bearing and unwavering loyalty. Victoria with her genuine concern and surprising wisdom. Jonathan with his newfound respect and obvious desire to make amends for earlier slights. "Why are you doing this?" I asked them. "All of you. A few hours ago, most of the people in this room wouldn't have given me the time of day." "Because," Victoria said simply, "sometimes it takes a crisis to remind people what really matters. And what matters isn't where you went to prep school, or whether your trust fund has 7 figures or 8. What matters is whether you show up when you're needed." Danny nodded emphatically. "With respect, sir, you've been selling yourself short for 3 years. You've been acting like leaving the army was the end of your story, when it was really just the end of Chapter 1. The question is," Jonathan said, "what do you want Chapter 2 to look like?" I thought about my studio apartment in Queens, my double shifts at the warehouse, my carefully constructed routine of invisible mediocrity. I thought about the person I'd been before, confident, respected, essential. And I thought about the person I could be again if I was brave enough to try. "When would I meet with your uncle?" I asked. Jonathan's face lit up. "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, his office in Manhattan." "And this crisis management position, what exactly would that involve?" "Corporate emergencies," Jonathan explained. Everything from natural disasters affecting overseas operations to PR crises that could tank stock prices. You'd be the person they call when normal procedures aren't enough, when they need someone who can think fast and act decisively. It sounded terrifying and exhilarating and exactly like the kind of work I'd been born to do. "There's one condition," I said. They all looked at me expectantly. "If I take this job, if this actually works out, I want Danny to come with me, as my second in command." Danny's eyes widened. "Sir, you don't have to." "It's not about having to," I cut him off. "It's about surrounding myself with people I trust. People who understand what it means to have someone else's back when everything's falling apart." Victoria clapped her hands together. "I love it. A whole crisis management team made up of veterans." "Richard will love it too," Jonathan added. "He's always saying that military experience is undervalued in the business world." I looked around the ballroom one more time. The same room where I'd felt invisible and unwelcome just hours earlier now felt full of possibility. Not because these people had suddenly decided to accept me, but because I'd remembered who I was beneath all the doubt and self-pity. "All right," I said. "Let's see what Chapter 2 looks like." The music swelled around us, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The next morning I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., holding a razor and wondering if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. The face staring back at me looked different somehow. Not younger, but more alert, like someone had turned up the brightness on a television that had been dimmed for years. My phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "Ready for this, Commander?" I'd given him Richard Whitmore's contact information the night before, along with my blessing to reach out directly. If we were going to do this, we were going to do it right, as a team, not as a favor I was doing for someone who'd saved my reputation at a wedding. "As ready as anyone can be for a job interview that started with CPR," I texted back. The truth was, I wasn't ready at all. I'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, of blending into the background and expecting nothing from life except the next paycheck. Now I was supposed to walk into one of the most powerful financial firms in the world and convince them I could handle their crises? But as I shaved and got dressed in the same suit I'd worn to the wedding, the only decent suit I owned, I found myself thinking about something William Whitmore had said to his granddaughter while he was lying on that table. Giving up was never an option for a Blackwood. Maybe it was time to stop giving up on being a Chen. Richard Whitmore's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower in Lower Manhattan. The elevator ride up felt like ascending to another planet, one where people made decisions that affected global markets, and where failure wasn't measured in personal disappointment but in millions of dollars lost. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 30s who probably earned more than I'd made in the past 2 years, greeted me with professional warmth. "Mr. Chen, Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. He's in conference room A with Mr. Martinez." Danny was already there, wearing a suit that actually fit him properly and looking more composed than I felt. He stood when I entered, a gesture that made me uncomfortably aware that we were about to role-play our old military dynamic in a very civilian setting. Richard Whitmore was exactly what I'd expected. Tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed, with the kind of presence that came from decades of wielding real power. What I hadn't expected was the genuine warmth in his handshake and the intelligence in his eyes that suggested he'd done his homework. "Michael," he said, "please sit down. I've been looking forward to this conversation since Jonathan called me last night." "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," I said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Nonsense. When my nephew tells me he's witnessed someone save a life and command a room full of people who were completely out of their depth, I make time." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with the intensity of someone used to making quick judgments about people. "Tell me about Afghanistan." The directness of the question caught me off guard. Most civilian employers tiptoed around military service, either treating it like a curiosity or a liability. Richard was treating it like a job credential. "I served 3 tours," I said, "started as a second lieutenant, left as a captain. Specialized in small unit tactics and crisis response. Jonathan mentioned you were involved in some kind of incident that ended your military career." I glanced at Danny, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. We'd talked about this moment, how much to reveal, how to frame what had happened without sounding like we were making excuses. March 15, 2019, I said. My unit was escorting a supply convoy through Kandahar province when we were ambushed by insurgents. I made the decision to engage directly rather than wait for backup. It saved 8 lives, including Sergeant Martinez here, but cost me my left knee and my ability to serve. Richard made a note on the pad in front of him. Tell me about that decision. Walk me through your thought process. The ambush was well coordinated, I said, falling into the rhythm of a military debrief. They had us pinned down with small arms fire from elevated positions, and they were moving to flank our position. Standard protocol would have been to call for air support and wait for extraction, but I assessed that we didn't have the time. The enemy was too close, and we had wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. So you deviated from protocol. I deviated from protocol because protocol was going to get my people killed. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but Richard didn't flinch. If anything, he looked more interested. What was your alternative strategy? I led a direct assault on the primary firing position, while Sergeant Martinez coordinated suppressive fire and casualty evacuation. The gamble was that we could neutralize the threat faster than they could complete their flanking maneuver. And it worked. It worked. We eliminated the hostile forces and evacuated all personnel. 0 fatalities on our side. Richard was quiet for a moment, making more notes. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. The injury that ended your career, how did that happen? This was the part I'd been dreading. The part where I had to explain that my heroic story ended with me taking a rocket-propelled grenade to the leg because I'd been too focused on my soldiers to notice the enemy repositioning. During the assault, I failed to identify a secondary firing position, I said simply. Took an RPG fragment to the knee joint. 14 months of reconstructive surgery and physical therapy before the Army decided I was no longer fit for active duty. Do you regret the decision? The question hung in the air between us. It was the same question I'd been asking myself for 3 years, usually at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come and the pain in my knee reminded me of everything I'd lost. No, I said, and realized as I said it that I meant it completely. I regret the outcome, but not the decision. Those 8 soldiers went home to their families because I chose to act rather than wait. That's worth a damaged knee. Richard set down his pen and leaned forward. Michael, I'm going to be direct with you. This company handles crises that affect billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. When oil rigs explode in the Gulf of Mexico, when cyber attacks threaten global supply chains, when political upheavals threaten our overseas operations, we're the people our clients call when normal risk management isn't enough. He paused, studying my face. The person who leads that division needs to be able to make decisions under extreme pressure, with incomplete information, where the wrong choice could destroy companies and lives. They need to be someone who won't freeze when the stakes are highest, who won't pass the buck when taking responsibility means accepting personal risk. I understand, I said. Do you? Because what I'm describing isn't just a job, it's a calling. It's choosing to be the person everyone else turns to when they're out of their depth. It's accepting that your decisions will have consequences you can't always predict or control. I thought about the ballroom last night, about the moment when I'd stopped being a spectator and started being a leader again. The weight of responsibility, the clarity of purpose, the sense of being exactly where I belonged. Mr. Whitmore, I said, for 3 years I've been trying to convince myself that I was better off invisible. That taking responsibility for other people's lives was too dangerous, too costly. Last night reminded me that I wasn't meant to be invisible. I was meant to be the person who steps up when everyone else steps back. Richard smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. Excellent answer. Danny, what about you? Are you ready to be second in command of a division that handles global crises? Danny straightened in his chair. Sir, I've followed Captain Chen into situations where the margin for error was 0 and the consequences of failure were death. Following him into situations where the consequences are financial seems considerably less daunting. Fair point. Richard stood up, extending his hand to both of us. Gentlemen, welcome to Whitmore Strategic Solutions. Your first assignment starts Monday morning. As we shook hands, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not healing, that would take time, but the beginning of healing. The sense that maybe Chapter 2 of my life could be better than Chapter 1. What's the first assignment? I asked. Richard's smile turned slightly predatory. A Category 4 hurricane is heading toward our client's offshore drilling platform in the Gulf of Mexico. Normal evacuation procedures have been compromised by equipment failures, and we have 18 hours to get 73 people off that rig safely. Danny and I exchanged a look. 18 hours, 73 lives, equipment failures, and a hurricane. It sounded exactly like the kind of impossible situation I'd been born to handle. When do we start? I asked. You already have. 6 months later, I stood in another ballroom. This one in downtown Houston, facing a room full of oil executives, Coast Guard officials, and safety inspectors. The difference was that this time, I wasn't an unwelcome guest trying to blend into the background. I was the keynote speaker at the National Offshore Safety Conference, and every person in that room was there to hear what I had to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out at the sea of faces. 6 months ago, Hurricane Patricia was bearing down on the Seahawk drilling platform with winds of 145 miles per hour. Standard evacuation protocols had failed, equipment was compromised, and 73 people were trapped 120 miles offshore with 18 hours until impact. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a satellite image of the hurricane, massive and menacing, spiraling toward the tiny dot that represented the platform. When Whitmore Strategic Solutions received that call at 6 p.m. on a Sunday evening, most crisis management firms would have recommended writing off the platform and hoping for the best. After all, evacuating an offshore facility in hurricane conditions isn't just dangerous, it's considered virtually impossible. A murmur went through the crowd. These people knew the statistics. They knew that once a Category 4 hurricane got within 24 hours of a platform, evacuation became a mathematical impossibility. But impossibility is a luxury we don't have when 73 lives are at stake. I advanced to the next slide, showing the innovative evacuation plan Danny and I had developed in 4 hours of intense brainstorming. Using a combination of Coast Guard cutters, private helicopters, and a revolutionary new transfer system we'd adapted from military Halo operations, we'd managed to get every single person off that platform with 3 hours to spare. The key wasn't having perfect conditions or unlimited resources, I continued. The key was understanding that in crisis situations, conventional wisdom is often the enemy of creative solutions. As I walked through the details of the operation, I caught sight of Danny in the back of the room. He was wearing his dress uniform. He'd been commissioned as a lieutenant in the Coast Guard Reserve after our success with Hurricane Patricia, and looked every inch the military professional he'd always been. Beside him stood Victoria and Jonathan, who'd flown down from Connecticut specifically to hear me speak. Victoria caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up, her smile radiant with pride. The operation was successful because we applied military principles to a civilian crisis, I said, advancing to footage of the actual evacuation. We treated it like a combat mission, with clear command structure, redundant backup plans, and the understanding that failure wasn't an option. What I didn't mention to the audience was how it had felt to be back in command again. The familiar weight of responsibility, the clarity that came with having a mission, and the authority to execute it. For the first time since Afghanistan, I'd felt like myself again. But perhaps the most important lesson from Hurricane Patricia isn't about crisis management techniques or innovative evacuation procedures. It's about the power of second chances. I clicked to a new slide, a photograph taken during the evacuation, showing Coast Guard personnel helping platform workers board a rescue helicopter. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Danny coordinating the airlift with the calm precision of someone born for leadership. 6 months ago, Sergeant Martinez was working catering events and wondering if his military experience had any value in the civilian world. Today, he's the operations coordinator for the largest crisis management firm on the East Coast and a decorated officer in the Coast Guard Reserve. Danny looked uncomfortable with the attention, but I could see the pride in his posture. He'd earned every bit of recognition coming his way. The truth is, this country is full of veterans who've been convinced that their skills don't translate to civilian success. People who've led soldiers through impossible situations but can't get interviews for management positions. People who've made life and death decisions under extreme pressure but are told they're not qualified to handle corporate challenges. I paused, scanning the room. Several people were nodding, and I noticed more than a few military haircuts in the audience. That's not just a waste of talent, it's a strategic vulnerability. Because the next time we face a crisis that requires unconventional thinking and decisive leadership, we're going to need people who understand that some problems can't be solved with PowerPoint presentations and committee meetings. The applause started before I'd finished the sentence. Not polite conference applause, but the kind of enthusiastic response that suggested I'd struck a nerve. After my presentation, the networking session was unlike anything I'd experienced in my previous civilian life. Instead of being invisible or tolerated, I was the center of attention. Oil executives wanted to discuss consulting contracts. Government officials asked about emergency response protocols. Other veterans approached to share their own stories of difficult transitions and eventual success. But the conversation that mattered most happened in a quiet corner of the ballroom, where Victoria and Jonathan had found me during a brief break from the crowd. "You look different," Victoria said, studying my face with the same perceptive intelligence she'd shown at her wedding. "Different how?" "Like yourself again." She was right. The man standing in this Houston ballroom bore little resemblance to the broken veteran who'd sat in a Queens apartment 6 months earlier, convinced that his best days were behind him. Not because my knee had healed, it would always be a reminder of that day in Afghanistan, but because I'd remembered that my value as a person wasn't diminished by my limitations. "I owe you both more than I can express," I said, "if you hadn't taken a chance on me." "We didn't take a chance on you," Jonathan interrupted. "We recognized what was already there, what had always been there." He was wearing a different kind of confidence now, too. 6 months of working closely with veterans had changed his perspective on leadership and privilege in ways that went far beyond charitable giving or social consciousness. "Besides," he added with a grin, "it's been good for business. Whitmore Strategic has had more new clients in the past 6 months than in the previous 2 years combined. Turns out corporate America is very interested in crisis management services run by people who've actually managed real crises." As the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, I found myself standing on the hotel's outdoor terrace, looking out at the Houston skyline. The city lights stretched to the horizon, each one representing lives and dreams and the endless human capacity for renewal. Danny joined me at the railing, carrying 2 beers from the bar. "Hell of a thing," he said, handing me one. "What's that?" "6 months ago, we were nobodies. Tonight, we're the guys who revolutionized offshore emergency response." I took a sip of beer, savoring the moment. "You know what the real hell of a thing is?" "What?" "We're just getting started." Danny raised his beer in a toast. "To second chances, then." "To second chances." As we clinked bottles, I thought about the invitation that had started this whole journey. A piece of cream-colored cardstock that had seemed like a painful reminder of everything I'd lost, but had actually been the key to everything I was meant to become. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives disguise themselves as ordinary events. A wedding invitation, a broken champagne glass, a young waiter who recognizes something in you that you've forgotten about yourself. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover who you really are. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get the chance to prove it. The Houston skyline glittered before us, full of possibility and promise. Tomorrow there would be new crises to manage, new challenges to overcome, new opportunities to be the person I'd been trained to be. But tonight, standing on that terrace with Danny beside me, and the memory of Victoria's proud smile fresh in my mind, I was exactly where I belonged. The waiter had been right after all. "Welcome back, Commander. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads."